greeting viewers, the Colonel speaking to you live from the preceptory for British Imperial YouTube Broadcasting, and here we are again, happy as can be, with the Squire for part 3 of his reminiscences of gramophone and other interesting memories. Good afternoon, Squire.
Good afternoon, Colonel. How are you?
Very well, thank you. And yourself, I trust?
Very well, thanks.
Welcome to the preceptory yet again.
Thank you.
We're not in the deluxe part, sadly, but we wanted to record somewhere where it was at least warm.
Oh, that's great.
Now, what would you like to talk about today? We've got a few questions. Would you?
Yes, I think let's do a few questions first.
Right, we've got a few questions from an online viewer, and he says, what are your views on reissuing of 78s on LP? Did you buy them in the 60s and 70s when they first started doing those?
I did buy them, and I bought them in some ways for the reason that it was often very difficult to find the original 78s. But on the other hand, not all the transfers that were done were very good. One of the problems is that they tended to deaden the sound too much. And a lot of the reissues on 78s were too muffled. I think they tried to take every little bit of surface noise off, and then you sort of lost the treble. And it was okay. It served its purpose, but I don't think it was as good as it could have been.
No, I suppose it broadened the audience for these things. There was obviously a great interest and hunger for these records, but the originals were not available. You know, I'm thinking. You know, I don't know whether the questioner, Rob, is thinking of anything in particular, but certainly the record of singing set was a landmark of its time and very expensive. Did you buy one new?
I bought one of the first ones in the pink boxes. That was the limited edition. I think they were limited to about 1,500 sets, if I remember rightly.
Yes.
And they cost, I think, around about between £45 and £50 a set, and that was in 1977.
It was.
As you say, it was a landmark reissue because it brought forward a lot of very early and rare recordings from the early years. I think the first one, wasn't it in 1898 to about 1914, the first album?
Yes, I believe
Something
it was,
like
yes.
that.
The second one, the green one, was 1915 to, I think, the end of the acoustic era.
Yes, it was more. It was certainly the operatic and song recordings up to the first World War.
It was a pity because that set came out, then there was a heck of a lot of criticism.
Oh yes, they got for some reason they got the speeds wrong on the transfers.
Some of them, yeah.
Some of them, they weren't all wrong, but some of them were wrong. But then again, if you play old records or even reissues from old records, you really need a turntable with adjustable speed.
Yes.
Because what they did eventually was to reissue the whole of that box, or all those 12 LPs were reissued again later with these speeds corrected.
I think the other complaint was that they'd got fairly poor quality copies and better quality copies turned up. Well, that's going to happen whatever you do.
Well, that's a catch-22 situation, isn't it? Because if you know of a poor copy, it's probably better than nothing. But what you don't know is what somebody's got sitting on their shelves. If somebody's got a mint condition record, well, it's there, but they didn't know about it.
And the price was very expensive. How did that relate to what people were earning weekly or monthly in those days?
Oh my word, that is asking a question. 77. I should think with me it was probably a week and a half, nearly 2 weeks' wages.
2 weeks' wages for a set of LPs.
Yeah, so it was a very expensive one because I wasn't on terribly good money at the time, but I think it was somewhere around about that. Yes. That's
a substantial investment, and no wonder they did them as a limited edition.
Oh, very much so.
You know, I didn't buy a set of that until fairly recent times. They just didn't come onto the market. So, well, we've got another question here, again from Rob, who says, what records were seen as junk in the 50s and 60s?
Well, I suppose really, in some ways, a bit like looked upon today. Some of the light orchestral, some of the classical orchestral weren't so sought after. I mean, where classical orchestral, of course, you've always got really famous performances. You've got composer-conducted performances and performances of artists that created the role, where they will always be interesting. But there was a lot of very routine stuff. I mean, like the album sets of symphonies and concerti. Well, the point is, today people are spoilt. If people wanted a recording of Beethoven's Symphony Number 5, I would think the number of recordings one could get hold of would run into hundreds. But in pre-war years, there was probably one or two versions by HMV, one or two versions by Columbia, maybe a Parlophone and a Decca, and that was the lot.
And a few odd sort of excerpts.
Exactly, but the point is that everybody who wanted that music bought those sets.
Yes.
It was like a set of recordings of the Brahms symphonies by Leopold Stokowski. I mean, everybody bought those sets because they were one of the few that were available. And continental issues were not easy to get hold of.
Now, I remember someone telling me that he'd paid £50 for a Cetra recording in the 1950s. That was a serious amount of money for a recording which would be of little interest today amongst collectors.
I know. There have always been some fantastic stories told. I remember once in the 70s, I remember watching on television, and this man was being interviewed, and he had just bought what he considered to be a brand new and unplayed copy of something very different. Bill Haley and his Comets, Rock Around the Clock.
Right.
And he'd given £45 for it.
Good Lord.
Well, that really caused a fuss, because it wasn't that rare. And within a week, I'd got a copy and I'd paid 10 pence for it.
Yeah.
Not new, but very, very good condition. So it does bring it home how easy it is to get lulled into a false sense of security by some of the stories that are put out.
Well, this is it. There's always a lot of nonsense spoken, really. Some people might say we're doing it now, but I don't think so. But the thing is, I think what Rob's saying is, were people very discriminating? Would they just have to accept any old condition copy they got hold of things, or did they sort of say, oh no, I'll have a better one, I'll be along?
I think the point is, it depends what one is looking for. If it was something like dance bands, then if it was popular recordings like dance bands, then it would be maybe a job to get a mint condition copy, because they were bought to be used, they were enjoyed, they were played during the war, and they often turned up in poor condition. But when it came to classical recordings, those were bought and played on special occasions, quite often on good equipment, and they lasted very well. And the greatest majority of classical sets of records turned up in very good condition.
Another question asked is a very, very good question, I must say. Thank you, Rob, again. And this is, you said you started to deal in gramophones at some point. When was this? Oh, hang on. And is there anything you sold and regretted?
Well, the story there is, as I may have mentioned before, I was working at one time for the Oxford University Press. Well, in 1989, the printing division of the building of the works closed down. The publishers kept going, but the printing division closed down, and we were all made redundant. Everybody from the printer to the university, who was the sort of head man of the printing house, right down to the more lowly ones like me, we were all made redundant. But about 18 months or 2 years before that, let's say about 1987, 86, 87, I could really see that the writing was on the wall. I realised that it was eventually going to go. We were having monthly briefings, and we were given figures, and the losses were just piling up, and I could see it, that it wasn't going to last. And then I had surplus gramophones in my collection, and I started doing flea markets, which were held at the press social place, which was called the Clarendon Press Institute. And it used to cost me the princely sum of £6 a day for a table. And I used to, the first one I remember, I took 2 gramophones, a radio, and 2 boxes of records, and I sold a portable for £25, and I thought I'd done very well. And that was what started it. And then, as time went on, I did more flea markets, and then it was getting to the stage that I was doing flea markets and antiques fairs on the Saturdays and the Sundays, and I was actually making more money doing the flea markets and antique fairs at weekends than I was making going to work.
I think for a lot of people that's a familiar story at that time.
Very much so. It was the start of the boom. It petered out in the early 90s, but in 1988-89, one couldn't get the stuff fast enough. The thing was that there'd been a change in change in politics, and people suddenly came into a lot of people came into a lot of money, and put it into getting bigger houses, and then they needed things to go in there, and I've sold a lot of gramophones.
It coincided with the sort of nostalgia boom
Exactly.
as well.
And the property boom, very much so. Yes, I had. I carried on with the antique fairs until it was just about 89, and then when I knew I was going to be made redundant, I went to see the people that ran the centre and said, look, I'm going to be finished in May, can I have a unit? And so we negotiated, and I got a unit in the antique centre, and I carried on selling from there, which was very enjoyable. It was great fun, because my week consisted normally, we had to do 2 days manning in the centre, so we sold for everybody else. So we didn't have paid staff, which was a big advantage, because then people aren't keen to get away at 5 o'clock if somebody was going to keep them until 5 past, which sometimes happens if you've got paid staff. And then if you weren't there, somebody else would sell for you, and if you were there, you'd sell for somebody else. So it all worked well with the security as well, keeping an eye on the place, and it worked very well.
But where did you get all these machines from that you sold? Where did they come from?
Well, I thinned out my own collection.
How many did you have at this time?
I think I may have had, in 1989, I'd probably got 70 or 80 machines.
Good Lord.
And I kept selling them till I'd got down to, I think at the finish, I got down to about 7, which included 1 portable. And I had to keep going, because I used to buy in when I could. I had to put adverts in the paper, so I put an advert in, and then I'd go and have a look at any replies that I had, maybe buy a few. But it was quite exciting times, because you just couldn't get the stuff fast enough.
Yes.
And you could double your money easily.
Oh yes, I remember those days.
Double your money, yes.
Double your money was not very ambitious.
No, it wasn't. No, indeed not.
We won't go into my personal reminiscences there, viewers. But what sort of things were you offered by people from the papers? Were you offered any 202s or 203s?
Oh no, it was basic stuff.
Apart from one you were offered that you seem to have forgotten about.
Oh yes, that's a long story. I'll go into that one a little later. But what was happening there was, it was mostly basic table models and portables.
Right.
The things that people were desperately yelling out for were horn gramophones. Now, couldn't get horn gramophones for love nor money.
Now, do you mean quality horn gramophones
or
any
horn gramophones?
Anything.
You see, this is just at the beginning of the repro period, because the original horn gramophones, A, went off the market, and B, the ones that did turn up were very expensive, and so the gap was they attempted to fill the gap by making these repros, and of course then it killed the trade in the horn gramophones completely, because people didn't know what they were buying.
Well, I think we should be a bit more specific. There were repros, direct fake copies with original motors, and there were what are now known as frankophones, which were very odd things made up from bits and pieces, and they were very prolific at that time.
Oh, they were indeed, yes.
They were all over the place.
Well, I had a case where a man in Oxford, he had a motor factor's place, and he came to me one day. He said, now look, I've bought this gramophone from the other centre. Where we were, they would not allow repro to be sold, so we had to keep the quality up, which was a good thing, because we picked up a lot of business. But the other one wasn't quite so hard on it, and one or two of the people used to sell these repros. And the trouble was, I mean, I don't care what people sell, as long as they tell the customer what they are. If it's a repro, tell them. Say, look, it's a repro, it's made up from bits and pieces, it's not a genuine machine. Well, anyway, this man came to see me, and he said, I've just bought this gramophone from up the road, and it doesn't work. Would you have a look at it for me? It's his master's voice horn gramophone. Well, anyway, I took the thing home and opened it up, and I very quickly put the bits aside and didn't touch it and took it back, and I went in a day or two later and went round to see him, and he asked him to come and see me at the centre. And I said, well now look, this gramophone, there's not one part of it that comes from an HMV machine.
Oh dear.
And they've got it badged up with all these fake HMV trademarks on the front. I said, look, this is not His Master's Voice motor, it's a cheap Continental thing, it's absolutely worn out, the sound, what it was one of those table gramophones, those hornless ones. Do you remember those Pathé Diamond ones, which had quite a long cabinet?
Yes, I do, yes.
Well, it was like that. It wasn't a diamond one, but it was a long cabinet with a back bracket. And somebody had taken the doors off and whacked a couple of a piece of blockboard across the front and stained it dark. And they would try to get a fantastic price for that.
Hundreds of pounds,
oh,
weren't
they were. It was it was stupid. And anyway, he took it back and complained and got his money back, and then they eventually sold him a genuine machine, so that was a good thing. But selling repro things did annoy me. I complained at quite big antique fairs about that, where people were doing that.
And at this time, the big antique fairs were I think they started earlier, didn't they, in the late 80s?
Yes, that's right.
But did you go to the big fairs? Did you find anything interesting at these big events?
I didn't, to be quite honest. It was before my time of going to places like Ardingly and Newark. I used to do most of my business from home. I'd go out, see my week, when I was in business, when I was full-time, I used to have to do 2 days manning at the antique centre, and then I'd perhaps go 2 or 3 days on the road looking for things, and I'd go on buying trips and go around antique centres and shops and try and find gramophones. I used to do quite well in Salisbury, thinking about it. There were 2 or 3 places in Salisbury. I remember going down there and coming back with carloads of things.
Right.
And I remember once I came back with 2 or 3 cabinet gramophones in the car, one of which was an HMV 163. And thereby hangs a very funny story. I went to Salisbury once, and they'd got this His Master's Voice table gramophone. It was probably a Model 9, mahogany, lovely condition. And they wanted too much money for it, you see. And so I didn't buy it. I thought, well, wait, I won't bother with that, it's just too expensive. Anyway, the next time I went down there, somebody had broken the spring.
Oh dear.
So anyway, they sold it to me a lot cheaper, and I bought the gramophone. I dismantled the motor, and what I found wasn't the spring had broken, but in the spring barrel, to link the spring barrels to the shaft, there was a silver steel pin of some sort, and the pin had sheared and lost the power in the motor. So I got somebody with an engineer, and he replaced the pin, and the gramophone was fine.
That's funny. Have you ever found anything interesting inside a gramophone cabinet or anything?
Well, the usual things one finds are perhaps a record catalogue stuck in the horn or something like that. I did buy a portable gramophone from a charity shop on the Cowley Road, and they stole it. Hasn't got a winding handle, have it for 10 quid or something, so I gave them what they wanted for it. Brought it home, and when I was carrying it on the car, I heard a rattle and then tipped it upside down, and out dropped the winding handle from inside the horn. But the best thing was, and this goes back to the 60s, I mentioned in one of my previous ramblings about the Church House sale in Witney.
Oh yes.
And that was a glorious local auction where they sold all sorts of bits and pieces. And this particular day I bought 2 cabinet gramophones. I think one was a Dulcetto and one may have been a Gilbert. Anyway, I was going to take them apart to do some work on them. I took the motor board out of the Dulcetto and wrapped up carefully in material was a drug taker's kit.
A drug taker's kit?
With powder, with the syringe, the whole wretched lot.
Oh my goodness.
Golly, that was quickly disposed of. So I must admit I did keep the syringe, not for doing that job, but I used to find it useful for lubricating things with thin oil. You could get a drop just where you needed it.
Well, yes, I suppose that's one way of looking at it.
Yes, that's right.
Dear, oh dear, oh dear. And how did you come, you went to see a 202 once, I understand.
Oh, that was a funny story as well. I think it was one of those questions. I was at another local antique fair. Oh no, it was the local music shop told me that there was this big gramophone, and the couple had got it, And what happened, now let me get it right, the wife wanted to sell it and the husband didn't. And they got me to look at it, and they said, well, we want to sell this gramophone. Well, I don't want to sell it, well, I want to sell it. And of course I got into this rather silly quarrel between husband and wife as to whether they sold it or not. So well, what do you think it's worth? I said, well, now look, what I will do, if you want me to, we could compromise, and I will replace the gramophone with a smaller one and give you a cash on the difference. Because I've got a 163. I thought, well, that would be a perfectly reasonable thing to replace the gramophone with. And it was a 20 HMV 203, a 202 that had been sold at Kemps's at Whitney. So they couldn't have sold many there, but I didn't hear any more about it. I'm afraid I didn't get it.
It's one of those strange things in the antiques business. If a husband wants to sell it and the wife doesn't want to, then you won't buy it. But if the husband doesn't want to sell it and the wife does, you will.
That's raises an interesting point with doing antique fairs. It was always a bit of fun, really, when people were coming round, sizing them up as to whether they might buy something. If you got somebody come up on their own and they were enthusiastic, you think, yes, they might buy one. But if it got to the stage I've got to ask my wife, girlfriend, boyfriend or husband, then you knew you were finished.
You never see them again.
If it got to that and the girl wanted to buy it, it was usually bought. If the husband wanted to buy it, often wasn't bought.
I found that certainly, although I wasn't there at the time, Brideshead Revisited certainly helped the gramophone trade, didn't it?
Oh, it certainly did. It did indeed, very much so. I used to do a lot of business with the students at the university because in those days they were on grants, and early on in the term they used to come round. The girls were looking for vintage costume and textiles, and a friend of mine had a unit there selling textiles and costumes, and I used to have a unit, a table in the yard in the early days selling the gramophones, and so I did quite well with the students. But as soon as they went on to, as soon as the grants were finished, that finished that business off. But Oxford was humming in those days, and of course you've got one person buy a gramophone, take it to a party. Half a dozen others thought, oh, we want one of those, where did you get that from? And it used to knock on. In fact, I remember once I did it was before I had a permanent unit at the Antique Centre. I had, I think, 6 gramophones on the table, and I got to the end of the day and I'd sold 5 of them, and somebody came up to look at the last one. Now, 5 portable and table gramophones in a day in the centre in those was pretty good. And it was only a cheap Mayfair portable, not in very good condition. I wound it up and the spring broke.
Oh dear.
And I said, right, are you here tomorrow? Yes, they said. I said, right, well, what I'll get it repaired tonight, I've got a spare spring, come back tomorrow and it'll be ready for you. I did it and I sold the gramophone.
Well, they actually came back.
They came back and they bought the gramophone. And another one I did was at Kidlington, and about 4 girls came round, and they'd obviously been on the liquid refreshment in the lunchtime and got a bit merry, and then they sort of goaded each other on till they bought one each. So I sold 4 machines that day.
Goodness me.
I know. It was like that then, and then the problem was to replace it. I had another fair where a man came to me. He got a lot of money. He bought a house and very expensive car. He said, "No, I want something really nice for this house." And I said, "Well, look, at home I've got a HMV cabinet gramophone, which is, I would think, early 1920s, and is immaculate." I said it will be £225 or something like that. And he said, "Great, okay." And so I said, "Well, I will meet you later on when I've finished this fair." Actually, when I'd got home, he'd already been there, seen my mother. She showed him the gramophone. He bought it, and they was just loading it up when I got back. I said, "What the heck's going on here? Oh, I'm going to have this gramophone. Great." And another one was I did a fair at Abingdon in the Abbey buildings, and I'd come to the end of the day and not sold anything much, and it got to the stage where we were loading up. It's one of those days where you had them where you were lucky to sell a packet of needles and a couple of records.
Yes.
Anyway, I was carrying this. It was a nice. There again, it was a nice table gramophone. It's a Model 9 again, or something like that. And these two ladies came around the corner and they said, "Oh, I suppose you've just bought that." I said, "No, I'm trying to sell it." "Really?" she said. "How much is it?" "Oh, right, we'll have that." So instead of loading it in the car, I carried it to theirs.
It's
And that was a funny one.
Very curious how these things happen. You know, there's an awful lot of serendipity to buying and selling things. And what about that wonderful Pathé machine you had and rather regretted selling? Didcot.
Oh, that brass horn one.
Mm.
Oh yes, that was a case where I had another person come and said they'd got this gramophone. It's got a big brass horn, and I went down and bought it. I think it was Long Whitman or somewhere like that, and I bought it. And I had a couple come into the centre who they were on the airlines, and they previously bought a wooden cased Delsetto portable from me,
Right.
and they wanted a gramophone, and I gave them a call. I said, "Look, I've got this one. It's a Pathé. It's a French one, so it was a Pathé. I think it was a Model G. It was one of those which had a brass horn, and you actually had a cover, a wooden cover that went over the turntable with the cockerel motive on it. It was really, really nice.
So it's one of the grander Pathés.
It was one of the grander Pathés, and I got £1,000 for that.
Good Lord.
I did very well on that.
It doesn't sound very expensive nowadays, viewers, that
those
people really like Pathés of that type, but then, you know, let's give some comparisons. What would an ordinary Swiss type machine with a painted tin horn, what would that have cost at the time?
What, about 1989? Well, the thing was, they were so difficult to come by that I could sometimes buy them in for about £250, and usually sell them for £750, £800. That was after sometimes quite a bit of restoration. It was very rarely you could buy something, just wipe it over and put it out. It usually had to have a considerable amount of work to get it running. And the problem is with those Swiss ones, particularly if they've got a one-piece tone arm, the motors aren't up to the weight of the tone arm, and they can't job to play the records anyway.
All the way through.
Oh no, I think the best they'll handle will be a 10-inch record, and if that's over-recorded, they won't play that either.
Well,
and you can put a new spring in, and it's exactly the same.
Yeah.
I used to talk to a gramophone, a man who used to repair them for real. We had really big problems with them trying to get them to go.
And sometimes they're worn to death anyway.
Well, that's another problem. That is another problem.
And the other thing is with the vertical governors, they make a lot of noise, which people don't like.
You see, vertical governors, that's a strange thing. You see, most of those cheap Swiss and German motors early ones had vertical governors. And yet I bought a gramophone once, and I think it was a Dale compact tone or something like that. It was a fairly straightforward gramophone, which could have been made in the 40s. And it was a Garrard motor, I could tell by the turntable and the speed regulator. When I played it, I heard this funny whirring sound. And when I took it out, it was a Garrard motor with vertical governors.
Right.
Just like the Swiss ones, but a Garrard. I think it was a number 23.
Good.
I haven't seen another one since.
And that compactor phone, that would be a late one, wouldn't it? It would be, what, post-war?
I would have thought so. It looked post-war, certainly, yes,
So
indeed.
post-war, Garrard were making vertical governor motors, it would seem.
But why? They've got the number 20, which is one of the most popular gramophone motors you can find. Why turn one out with vertical governors? It doesn't make any sense.
Well, it's nuts, isn't it? It's like a lot of these strange things companies do. It's very peculiar. Rob also asks, is there anything after all these years, is there anything you're still looking for? I don't mean the item sitting next to you in the chair there. We're not going to discuss what that is, viewers.
Well, that's a very interesting question. You see, when people say, what am I looking for? It's like when I go out to look at records. What am I looking for? I don't know until I see it. You see, it's one of those funny things where I don't know really. I've got a lumiere. I expect I'll probably get an automatic number 1 HMV one day when if I can get room for it. That
We
would be
can
nice
organise that for you. Do not worry about that. We've got lots of things hidden away at the preceptory. We could help. What's your wants list? We take cash, cheques, milk bottle tops, gold sovereigns. But no, is there anything else? But mind you, I think that's a universal truth of collecting that should be, emphasised to people. You don't know until you see it. It's all right looking in books and catalogues for certain records, but there are some things that are so way out when you see them. You think, well, I've got to have that.
Well, that's true. It was like we were at an antiques fair in, I think it was an Arding night, and Anne was with me as my lady friend, and we were walking around, and she said, have you seen that gramophone down there? I said, yes. It was a scruffy looking thing. I looked at it and thought, oh, what the heck is it? But anyway, I looked at it again, and it got the word aerophone on it. I actually got it for £25, and it was a remarkably quite unusual machine. Yes. I think it could have been one of the ones they called a night or day gramophone,
yes,
which has got bits missing, but it's a very interesting table gramophone, a hornless model I should say, and it's got sort of transfer decoration all the way round it. It rather looks like sort of Art Nouveau, sort of secessionist, doesn't it?
It's a sort of Germanic Art Nouveau look to it.
That's right.
There are pictures of complete ones in those American books you can get.
I see.
And I think this one, as I say, possibly missing a few bits, or it was just one of those models where they didn't sell it with the horn attachment. You never know with French companies. Pathé and the other French companies are very odd. They're a law unto themselves, and that's why there are very few books on them, because almost every model is unique. It's a bit puzzling, but anything you can think of that you're really looking for?
Oh dear, that's a very tricky. That is a very.
But you're pleased with your Lumiere, aren't you?
Yes, that was a very good one. That works very well. That's one I was looking for, and I managed to get hold of one of those in very nice condition. As I say, it's very difficult. It's very difficult for me to say really. There's so much out there. You just don't know what you're going to walk round the corner in a place and see. This is the thing.
Rob also asked, do you listen to more modern things like MP3 files and things like that?
I'm afraid I don't. I'm not really up with that. I listen to quite a lot of things on YouTube, of course, because YouTube channels are very, very interesting. There's a lot of fantastic stuff on YouTube. I mean, they're things that years ago you'd have only dreamed of hearing. I mean, you played me one early today, some of the Lionel Mapleson cylinders made in 1903, and then there's the 1888 Crystal Palace recordings, which you can hear on YouTube. Well, one would have never have heard those years ago. In fact, of course, and even more exciting, they're those paper sheets made by Leon Scott de Martinville in 1850, aren't there? Those phonautograph recordings.
Yes, which have been sort of translated into sounds. Extraordinary.
Yes, exactly. Yes, that's right.
Oh, you could have read about all these things in books, but actually hearing these things, unless it was some sort of specialist BBC radio programme, it would have been impossible.
Exactly.
Extraordinary.
So yes, it's a job to know really what the next holy grail is to try and find.
I suppose again the answer is you'll know it when you see it.
Well, it's like records really. I look at lots of records. I started collecting vinyl a few years ago, and I get quite a lot of I've got quite a lot of vinyl now. I've still got some 78s, and there again, I do that principally because it's stuff I can find. Because you can look all the way around and find nothing much on 78s, but there's loads of vinyl in charity shops, and it just gives me a bit of fun going through and maybe finding one or two of interest.
I suppose we should say one final story about the first horn gramophone you ever owned, which was a very simple thing. Why don't you tell us about that and how it reappeared recently?
Oh, that was funny. That was going back to the 1960s when a friend of mine in Whitney said that he got hold of it. Somebody had given him a horn gramophone, and it was. He said, well, I think his parents wouldn't let him keep it. That's what it brought down to. Anyway, it came to me, and it was I suppose, I don't know whether it was Continental or what, but the horn was extraordinary. It was a plain green horn, a bit like a funnel,
Mm.
Funnily enough, the throat part of it looked professionally made because it had a proper lock-on fitting but the horn itself just looked like it might have been made by the local blacksmith out of a piece of sheet tin. And anyway, I had this, and the funny part about it was the winding back check spring had broken, and of course the chances of getting another one were minimal. So what I used to do, I had one of those big £4 weights, do you remember them, with
Yes.
a ring on the end?
Yes.
Used to wind the gramophone and then hang the £4 weight on the handle, stop the thing flying back. And I used it like that for years. Well, eventually, when I got a bit more advanced and did repairs, I got it repaired and working properly with a back check spring, and eventually I sold it. And then, blow me, about in the spring of this year, it turns up on eBay. Somewhere near Wantage, I think it was.
So it hadn't travelled far.
It was this very same gramophone. I couldn't believe it. I never thought I'd see that again.
Yeah, I think they were commercially made. They were just very, very cheap, sold by cycle companies and things like that. Swiss base, I believe,
right.
or sort of continental base.
Yes.
With just this very simple flared horn, just like a funnel.
It was literally like a funnel. It's like one of those awful horns you see in some of those cheap plywood sided cabinet gramophones.
Oh yeah, yes, I've seen one or two of those in the past.
Gosh, yes.
I've been very surprised to see those. I rapidly got rid of the machine after having those.
I know.
Dear, oh dear, oh dear. Well, our time's up for today, for this video. More videos soon. Thank you very much, Squire, on behalf of the viewers. I hope you enjoyed it, viewers, and we'll no doubt be making more videos soon. Thank you, and goodbye.
Bye-bye.